Okay. I want you to know I think I'm okay. All right. So, man, chapters 21 and 22. Uh, Tear jerkers. I'm just telling you. And here I even, like I told you, I've read this before several times. And I read it last week and cried and cried and cried and thought I'd be okay doing it this time. But it just touches me. But like I told you, that just shows you really get into a book when you get that invested in it, which is kind of neat. It's kind of a neat thing. Okay, so we're going to do chapter 23 today. I've got our words up here. We have meager, which just means a little bit, a little amount of something. Threadbare, I believe they're going to be talking about Matt's clothing as being threadbare, meaning that they're very worn out. Like some of your uniform pants are probably getting threadbare, especially in the knees. That happens where they're almost on the verge of getting a hole, okay, maybe even a hole. Then we have scant, which means just a little bit, a scant amount of sugar, meaning there's not much there. Pelt, pelt is an animal skin, okay? And then finally, trencher, um, that's what they used as a dish. It's kind of a bowl type situation, usually made of wood, like they kind of hollow out part of a wood piece, and that's what they would use for a bowl, or what they would use to eat their stew in, or whatever food they were having. Wooden trenchers, or what they're called. Kind of reminds me of a trough or something, like an animal trough. Okay, so in 21 and 22, Sockness and Etienne had come to ask Matt, please, come with us. We just don't think your family's coming back. It's not looking good. Come live with the Indians. And as much as Matt wants to do that, he's thinking that sounds kind of appealing. He says, you know what, I can't. Thank you. It sounds like a great offer, but my family's coming. I need to wait for my family. And remember, Sockness and Etienne had said, it doesn't look like they're coming, and we hate the thought of you being out here all alone. No one is nearby. We're leaving now. You're going to be all by yourself. You really need people with you. The snow's coming. And Matt said, I need to stay. My family won't know what's happened to me. He's still so hopeful that his mom and dad and little sister and the new baby will be coming. Okay, so let's see. Have you been making your predictions? Were you able to hold off reading it, or were you so inquisitive, like you wanted to know so badly that you went ahead and read it anyway? That's okay. That's kind of neat. All right, chapter 23. Matt filled his days with work. He made the cabin trim. Where the clay had dried and crumbled away between the logs, he brought new mud, strengthened it with pebbles, and packed the spaces tightly. So he's getting the cabin all ready so it's nice and cozy in the winter. On the inside, he chinked every tiny crack to make the room snug. The pile of logs stacked against the cabin wall grew steadily higher. His meager harvest was safely stored away. The corn, the little he had managed to save from the deer and crows, had all been shucked. Sitting by the fire after his supper, he scraped the dried kernels from the cobs, remembering the many long evenings at home when he and his sister Sarah had been set to the same work with a corn scraper. Sarah would laugh now to see him rubbing away with an old clamshell like an Indian. So one of the tricks that he picked up from an Indian was scraping with a clamshell. Some of the ears of corn he had hung against the wall by the twisted husks, as he had seen his mother do. She had said once they were like scraps of sunshine in the dark days. Overhead he hung strips of pumpkin on ropes of vine strung from wall to wall. They would be ready for his mother to make into pies. So he's getting everything ready. That's how he's keeping his days busy. There's no one else. Remember how long he said his days were when Etienne didn't come to visit him? And now that they're gone, nobody's there now. So he's trying to do the best to keep his days busy. Otherwise, he's going to go bonkers being alone there. In a corner leaned the old flour sack, overflowing with the nuts he had gathered, hickory and butternut, and even the acorns he had once thought proper food only for squirrels. So he's collecting just about anything he thinks could possibly be eaten because he's going to need the food. On the shelf ranged birch baskets filled with dried berries and the wild cranberries he had discovered shining like jewels along the boggy shores of the pond. They were puckery to the tongue, but when his mother came, she would bring sugar, and the stewed cranberries would make a fine treat with her bread of white flour. Matt forced himself to eat sparingly, meaning he's trying not to eat much because he wants to save as much food as possible for when his family comes. Matt forced himself to eat sparingly of these things. The corn he regarded as a sort of trust. His father had planted it and would be counting on it to feed the family through the winter. And some must be saved for the spring planting. Proud though he was of his harvest, Matt knew in his heart that it was far from enough. The hunt for food would be never ending. Hour after hour with his bow, Matt tramped through the forest, the dog beside him. Remember Etienne's dog that he left for Matt. There was not much game to hunt these days. More often than not, his snares were empty. Soon the animals would be buried deep in burrows. Twice he had glimpsed a caribou moving through the trees, but he had little hope of bringing down any large animal with his light arrows. So if he had a gun, he'd be able to get much more food. But remember, he only has the bow and arrow, and you can't take down very big animals with that. Once in a long while, he succeeded in shooting a duck or a muskrat. The squirrels were too quick for him. Although the dog was certainly not much of a hunter, he did occasionally track down some small creature. But he also had to eat his share, sometimes more than his share, because Matt could not resist those beseeching eyes. Truth to tell, they were both hungry much of the time. So remember, as little food as Matt has, he's sharing it with his dog. And, gosh, thank goodness he has the dog. How lonely it would be if he didn't even have the dog. So that was very kind of Etienne to share the dog with Matt, who knew that it would bring him so much comfort and company. Luckily, they would not starve with the pond and creeks teeming with fish. Matt knew that for many months of the year, fish filled the Indian cookpots. Luckily, too, fish were easy to catch, though Matt had to be continually twisting and splicing new lines from vines and spruce roots. Again, another thing Etienne had taught him. Mornings now, he had to shatter a skim of ice on the pond. Soon he would have to cut holes with his axe and let his lines down deep, like ice fishing. He shivered to think of it. It was the cold that bothered him most. His homespun jacket was still sound, since he had had little use for it in the warm weather, but his breeches, meaning his pants, were threadbare. One knee showed naked through a gaping hole, and the frayed legs stopped a good 5 inches above his ankles. So it sounds like he's grown a little bit, huh? His linen shirt was thin as a page of his father's Bible, and so small for him that it threatened to split every time he moved. Even inside the cabin, he was scarcely warm enough. The moment he ventured outside, his teeth chattered. He thought enviously of the Indian's deerskin leggings, but a deer was far beyond his prowess as a hunter. There were 2 blankets on his pine bed, his father's and his own. Why couldn't one of them cover him in the daytime as well as in the night? He spread a blanket out on the floor, now make your pictures, okay, and hacked it with his axe and his knife. He doesn't have a nice little pair of scissors, using his worn-out breeches as a pattern. So he's laid the blanket flat on the floor and laid his pants down on top of it to use as a pattern. He's going to make himself a new pair of pants. From the leftover scraps, he carefully pulled threads and twisted them together. He had seen the Indian women using bone needles, and he searched about outside the cabin till he found some thin, hard bits of bone. These he shaved down with his knife. He ruined 3 bits by trying to poke a hole through the bone before he thought to try a thin slit instead to hold the thread. So again, he's using all these skills that he watched the Native Americans use. Finally, he managed to sew his woolen pieces together. He thrust his legs into the shapeless breeches and gathered the top about his waist with a bit of rope. He was mighty pleased with himself. He was going to be forever hauling them up, and they were sure to trip him if he had to run, but at least he could kneel on the ice and pull in his lines. So he's made a decent pair of pants, maybe a little bit too big, but it's better. It'll keep him a little bit warmer than his threadbare breeches. From 2 rabbit skins, he made some mittens without thumbs. He had no stockings, meaning socks, and his moose hide moccasins were wearing thin. He decided he could stuff them with scraps of blanket or even with duck feathers. You know, he's very resourceful. He remembered that once in a downpour, Etienne had shown him how to line his moccasins with dried moss to soak up the rain. Perhaps moss could soak up the cold as well, and there was plenty of it about. His most satisfying achievement was his fur hat. For this he knew he must have more fur. In the woods, Etienne had once pointed out to him a deadfall constructed of heavy logs so intricately balanced that they would fall with deadly accuracy on an animal that attempted to steal the bait inside. So it's another way to capture an animal. Beaver and otter were caught in such traps, Etienne explained, sometimes even bear. Now Matt determined to make one for himself. Perhaps a small one. It would take a very large log even to stun a strong animal, and he had no wish to come upon a wounded bear. Much as he would like a bear skin, he would try for a smaller animal. He felled and trimmed 2 good-sized trees. Setting the logs on lighter posts was a feat of delicate balance that took him hours of patient trial and error. Over and over they crashed down, threatening his toes and fingers. Finally, they held to his satisfaction, and gingerly he slipped 3 fish inside the trap. To his astonishment, on the 3rd morning, he found an animal lying under the fallen logs, so nearly dead that it was no task to club it. It was smaller than the otters he had seen playing along the banks. A fisher, perhaps? That night he and the dog feasted on crackling bits of roast meat. It was strong flavored, and he knew the Indians did not care to eat it, but he could not be so choosy. Other strips he hung over the fire to smoke. There was also a scant amount of yellow fat. Used sparingly, a spoonful of that fat would make his usual fish diet taste like a banquet. The real treasure was the pelt, heavy and lustrous. He worked on it slowly, as he had watched the Indian women work. With a sharp-edged stone, he scraped away every trace of fat and flesh from the skin, washed it in the creek, and for days, in his spare hours, rubbed and stretched it to make it soft and pliable. Then he set to work with his bone needle. He was enormously proud of the cap he had fashioned. Sockness himself would have envied it. So, boy, that's pretty impressive, isn't it? Most of this work he had done by firelight. He longed for candles. He ate his supper by the light of split pine branches set in a crack in the chimney. They gave light aplenty, but they smoked and dripped sticky pitch, and he was always afraid he might drop off to sleep and wake up to find the log chimney afire. At any rate, after a day of chopping and tramping, he was tired enough to go to bed with the dark. So if it's getting dark at 7 o'clock, that's when he'll go to sleep, because he's worked so hard, he's pooped. So often as he did the squaw work that Etienne would have despised, so remember, he's doing the work that the girl Indians would have been doing, and Etienne just thought that was ridiculous. But Matt doesn't care. He's doing what he needs to do, isn't he? And he learned a lot from watching them. Thoughts of his mother filled his head. He imagined her moving about the cabin, humming her little tunes as she beat up a batch of cornbread, shaking out the board cloth at the door, for of course she would not let them eat at a bare table. A board cloth is a tablecloth. He could see her sitting by the firelight in the evening, her knitting needles clicking as she made a woolen sock for him. Sometimes he could almost hear the sound of her voice, and when he shut his eyes, he could see her special smile. He tried to think of ways to please her. She would need new dishes for the good meals she would cook, so he's doing everything to get ready for his family. He whittled out 4 wooden trenchers and 4 clean new bowls, rubbing them smooth with sand from the creek. He made a little brush to clean them with from a birch sapling, carefully splitting the ends into thin fibers. In the same way, he made a sturdy birch broom to sweep the floor. Then he set himself a more difficult task, a cradle for the baby. With only an axe and his knife, The work took all his patience. His first attempts were fit only for kindling, but when the cradle was done, he was proud of it. It was clumsy, perhaps, but it rocked without bumping, and there wasn't a splinter anywhere to harm a baby's skin. Sitting by the fire, it seemed a promise that soon his family would be there. When he had a few more rabbit skins, he would make a soft coverlet. For Sarah, so he's doing something everybody in the family would be proud of or appreciate. For Sarah, he made a corn husk doll with corn silk hair. He was surprised at how much he looked forward to Sarah's coming. Back at home, she had been nothing but a pesky child, always following him about and pestering him to be taken along wherever he was going. Now he remembered the way she had run to meet him when he came home from school, pigtails flying, eyes shining, demanding to know everything that had happened there. Sarah hated fiercely being a girl and having no school to go to. So back then, girls didn't go to school, it was only boys. Doesn't seem fair, does it? She would be full of curiosity in the forest. She wasn't afraid like most girls. She was spunky enough to try almost anything. I like Sarah. She was like that Indian girl, Etienne's sister. What a pity they couldn't have known each other. So remember, Matt had said they would like each other's company. He thought Marie and Sarah could be friends, even though they weren't the same age. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 23. Now, when we come back together, we'll be reading chapters 24 and 25, the last two chapters in the book. So go ahead and make your predictions. What do you think might be happening? You might want to, it would be a good time to go back and look at all your chapter summaries, just kind of read through those, and then make your predictions about what chapters 24 and 25 are going to be about, okay? So when we come together, that'll be the last chapter. You know, you're thinking about your book report, what you're going to do. Either dress as the character, make a little booklet, make a scene, get all in scene with the background and everything and have somebody take a picture of it, or do a diorama. All the information explaining that more has gone home. So make sure you look at that so you do the right thing. And you also must write a summary, okay, to go with it. So make sure you follow the rubric. It's on the bottom of that book report sheet. That's how you'll be graded. And if you don't do it correctly, you won't get credit for everything. So you want to do your best on it, okay? All right, so we will be together again soon. Have a great day. Bye.